Some stories do not remain in the past. They return. They return because human beings keep recreating the conditions that made those stories necessary in the first place. The costumes change, the technologies change, the scale changes, the names change, but the underlying drama remains strangely familiar. That is why, in Garden of Wisdom, I return again and again to three foundational stories: Eden, Babel, and Exodus. At first glance, they seem to belong to another world: a garden, a tower, a desert road out of slavery, ancient symbols, ancient people, ancient dilemmas. And yet, I believe these are among the most modern stories we possess, because they speak directly to the age we are now entering, an age of artificial intelligence, planetary systems, accelerating power, moral confusion, and a deep uncertainty about what kind of civilization we are becoming. So today I want to revisit these three stories, not as relics, but as mirrors, because Eden is still with us, Babel is still with us, Exodus is still with us, and the future may depend on whether we learn how to read them again. Let us begin in the garden. Eden is often reduced to a story about innocence and disobedience, but in Garden of Wisdom, I read it more broadly as a story about knowledge, desire, boundaries, and the moral cost of reaching too quickly for power one is not yet ready to carry. That makes Eden intensely relevant to the AI age, because what is our century, if not a great expansion of access? Access to knowledge, access to simulation, access to influence, access to prediction, access to synthetic creation, access to tools that would have seemed impossible not long ago. We are surrounded by new fruit, and like all fruit of knowledge, it is beautiful, it is persuasive, it is full of promise. It tells us we will see more, know more, do more, become more, and much of that is true. The issue is not that knowledge is bad. The issue is that knowledge without wisdom becomes unstable. That is Eden. Eden is what happens when capacity outruns character, when curiosity outruns discernment, when power enters the hands of beings who are not yet morally deep enough to govern it well. That is why the story matters. It is not anti-knowledge, it is anti-naivety. It reminds us that the question is never only, can this be known? The question is also, what kind of being is receiving this knowledge? A child with a weapon is not the same as an adult with a weapon. A civilization with powerful systems is not the same as a wise civilization. And this is exactly the tension we face now. We are building tools that can write, persuade, diagnose, imitate, predict, surveil, influence, and perhaps one day exceed human capacity across many domains. The excitement is understandable. The possibilities are real. But Garden of Wisdom asks a harder question. What happens when a civilization gains unprecedented knowledge without a corresponding growth in moral wisdom? What happens when the tree of knowledge grows faster than the tree of life? Because that, in essence, is the Eden problem. The real danger is not intelligence itself, it is intelligence detached from reverence. It is light without love, power without stewardship, knowledge without the inner maturity needed to keep life at the center. And the consequences are not only personal, they are ecological, social, spiritual, and civilizational. Once human beings begin to act as if access itself is wisdom, the whole atmosphere changes. Boundaries are dismissed as primitive, restraint is mocked as fear, speed becomes proof of worth. And the subtle disciplines that protect life begin to look like obstacles instead of guides. That is how innocence is lost. Not because intelligence appears, but because intelligence appears without enough depth to carry it well. Now let us move from the garden to the tower. If Eden is the story of knowledge without wisdom, Babel is the story of scale without humility. Humanity gathers, it unifies, it builds upward. It seeks greatness through coordination, reach, and magnitude. These too should sound familiar. We live in the age of Babel. We admire scale. We reward scale. We trust scale. The largest platform, the fastest growing system, the most connected network, the most expansive infrastructure, the most global intelligence. The modern world is deeply enchanted by size, and in many ways, scale is extraordinary. It allows medicine to spread, communication to connect, coordination to happen, knowledge to move, cooperation to extend across distance. But Babel reminds us that scale has its own temptation. The temptation is to believe that because something is large, it is also wise, that because something is connected, it is also just, that because something reaches everywhere, it should rule everywhere. That is the Babel illusion. Babel is not just a story about architecture. It is a story about civilizational overconfidence. It is about the desire to rise high enough that we no longer feel vulnerable, to build something so immense that it appears to justify itself, to create one structure powerful enough to stabilize meaning, identity, and power from the top down. In Garden of Wisdom, I revisit Babel because modern technological civilization is repeating that pattern in digital form. We are building towers of data, towers of surveillance, towers of centralized intelligence, towers of algorithmic coordination, towers of cultural influence, towers of economic concentration, and all of them whisper the same promise. If only the system becomes large enough, integrated enough, intelligent enough, then confusion will disappear. But confusion does not disappear just because scale increases. In fact, sometimes scale magnifies confusion. That is one of Babel's deepest insights. A civilization can become technically coordinated and morally incoherent at the same time. It can speak through one global infrastructure and still not understand itself. It can be hyperconnected and spiritually fragmented. It can be networked and lonely, efficient and unstable, expansive and inwardly lost. Babel warns us that not every ascent is elevation. Some forms of upward movement are really inflation. They increase magnitude without increasing wisdom, reach without increasing responsibility, power without increasing humility. And when that happens, the apparent strength of the system hides a deeper weakness. Why? Because systems built on pride eventually lose proportion. They stop listening. They begin to treat scale as moral authority. They confuse technical superiority with human maturity. That is precisely the danger in the AI age. The more powerful our systems become, the more tempted we are to treat them as inevitable, to surrender judgment to their outputs, to assume that because they can coordinate, predict, and optimize, they should also decide what is real, what is valuable, and what kind of future ought to exist. But Babel tells us, be careful. A tower can rise very high and still lead nowhere worth going. And if Eden asks whether we are wise enough for the knowledge we seek, Babel asks whether we are humble enough for the scale we are building. Now let us move to Exodus. If Eden is knowledge and Babel is scale, Exodus is power. Power, slavery, liberation, memory, law, wilderness, and the difficult work of becoming free. This may be the most urgent story of all for the age we are entering, because one of the great illusions of modern technological culture is that more tools automatically mean more freedom. But that is not always true. A technology can liberate in one sense and enslave in another. It can remove one burden and create a deeper dependency. It can promise empowerment while redesigning control. It can increase convenience while narrowing autonomy. It can give access while concentrating power elsewhere. That is why Exodus matters. It teaches us that living bondage is not the same as becoming free. And in Garden of Wisdom, I revisit Exodus as a story not only of escape but of moral formation. Because liberation without wisdom does not last. A people can leave Egypt and still carry Egypt inside them. A civilization can reject one form of domination and recreate it under a new name. A society can denounce tyranny while quietly building systems of dependence, surveillance, and managerial control that erode freedom from within. That is our danger. We may think we are marching into the future, while unknowingly carrying Pharaoh's logic into our most advanced systems. What is Pharaoh's logic? Efficiency over dignity, order over personhood, productivity over life, centralized control over human freedom. The reduction of human beings into units inside a machine of power. And that logic is not ancient, it is always available. It appears whenever a society values compliance more than conscience, whenever data matters more than dignity, whenever systems become too large to remember that people are not raw material. Exodus tells us that true freedom requires more than escape. It requires covenant, memory, discipline, law, inner transformation. It requires learning how not to become the thing one fled. That is one of the hardest lessons of all, because it means the challenge of civilization is not only overthrowing domination, it is refusing to reproduce domination in smarter forms. And this is why Exodus belongs in every serious conversation about AI governance and the future. If we build systems that increase capacity but weaken agency, are we more free? If we create environments that make thought easier but judgment thinner, are we more free? If we automate convenience while deepening dependence, are we more free? Exodus would tell us, do not answer too quickly. Freedom is not merely the absence of visible chains, it is the presence of moral and spiritual conditions in which human beings can become responsible participants in life. That includes the ability to choose, to remember, to resist, to question power, to preserve dignity, to remain answerable to something higher than expediency. So, when I revisit Eden, Babel, and Exodus in Garden of Wisdom, I am really trying to offer a three-part map for our time. Eden asks, will knowledge be guided by wisdom? Babel asks, will scale be guided by humility? Exodus asks, will power be guided by liberation? These are not separate questions, they are intertwined, because once knowledge expands, scale follows, and once scale grows, power concentrates. And once power concentrates, the battle over freedom begins. That is the pattern, and it is one reason our current century feels so charged. We are living through all three stories at once. We are eating from new trees of knowledge. We are building new towers of coordination. And we are entering new struggles over what freedom means under the reign of increasingly intelligent systems. That is why the old stories feel alive, not because the past is repeating mechanically, but because the human condition keeps reaching the same thresholds in new forms. Now, let me go one level deeper. What these three stories share is a common warning. Power is never self-justifying. Knowledge does not justify itself. Scale does not justify itself. Liberation slogans do not justify themselves. Everything depends on orientation. What is this power serving? What kind of world is it creating? What kind of human being is it shaping? What happens to the vulnerable under its rule? Does it deepen life? Or does it subtly separate us from life while promising progress? Those are the questions Garden of Wisdom keeps returning to. Because the future is not just being built externally, it is being cultivated internally. The systems we design will reflect the stories we unconsciously live by. If we live by Eden without wisdom, we will chase knowledge without restraint. If we live by Babel without humility, we will worship scale without meaning. If we live by Exodus without moral formation, we will call ourselves free while rebuilding Egypt in new forms. That is why reinterpretation matters. We do not revisit these stories to become nostalgic, we revisit them to become more conscious, to recognize when the garden is becoming temptation, when the tower is becoming idolatry, when liberation language is becoming camouflage for new dependency, and perhaps most importantly, to remember that there is another path, a path in which knowledge is joined to wisdom, scale is joined to humility, power is joined to liberation, technology is joined to stewardship, and intelligence grows not away from life but toward it. That is the possibility I try to defend in Garden of Wisdom. Not rejection of the future, not fear of intelligence, not retreat into ancient language for its own sake, but a deeper reading of what civilization must become if it is to survive its own capacities. Because the central issue of our age is not merely what we can build, it is whether we can build without betraying life, whether we can know more without becoming less wise, whether we can connect more without becoming more fragmented, whether we can become more powerful without becoming new pharaohs to one another. That is the challenge, and that is why these stories remain so necessary. Eden reminds us that excess is not the same as maturity. Babel reminds us that magnitude is not the same as meaning. Exodus reminds us that escape is not the same as freedom. If we can remember that, then perhaps the future of AI and civilization will not be driven only by acceleration. Perhaps it can be guided by discernment. Perhaps the human story can still mature. Perhaps the old stories are not behind us at all. Perhaps they are standing at the threshold of the future, waiting to see whether we have finally learned how to read them. As above, so below. In Garden of Wisdom, I argue that Eden, Babel, and Exodus still matter because they reveal the three great tests of the future: whether knowledge is guided by wisdom, scaled by humility, and powered by liberation in service of life